Well, welcome, Dr. Adam Friedman. How are you?
Good, Stephen. How you doing, man? Dr. Wang, great to see you.
Well, you're another one of the dear friends. I've known you for so long. I think I'm gonna just use your first name, Adam.
Please do. You got through me for a loop there with the whole Dr. Friedman thing. Who's that
We
guy?
try we
My,
try to be official. And
my
anyway,
father, who you hang out with.
so we got another great treat, and I have Dr. Adam Freeman, who is the professor and also the chair of dermatology department at the George Washington University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. And I think Dr. Freeman actually, perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, the youngest chairperson in the country for any of the dermatology program, I think.
I, that may not be true anymore, which is
Okay.
certainly exciting that we are seeing the emergence of some really young, hungry, and very productive chairs. But there certainly was a time, a window where that would have been true.
Well, no, in addition to being the chief, the chairperson, and you also is the director of the translational research, director of the supportive oncology program. You've have been very, very prolific, and you've written almost 200 some papers and two books. I know you and I sort of did one book together on the nanodermatology, so that was very exciting. And today we have this is something that we're both very passionate about, sunscreen, right? And so before we even jump into sunscreen, and let's step back a little bit and talk about, what is your philosophy about photo protection? And usually people always automatically jump into sunscreen, but before we jump into sunscreen, what other modalities out there? What do you recommend to your patients?
Yeah, I think it's simple behaviors. The truth is the best sunscreen is something that will physically block the sun. So you're thinking about clothing choices, certainly is very important. Hats, sunglasses, whether long sleeves, pants. I always joke with my patients, the muggy, humid, swamp-like environment of DC in the summer, not very conducive to that type of clothing. But I think we're fortunate we live during a time where you can have your cake and eat it too, and there's clothing designed to both protect but also to really acclimate to the environment. Not saying that's very fashionable, but it does a trick, no question. I think certainly seeking shade when possible, though that's not always possible. And I always say that caveat, like these are the things you can do. You have to figure out what's best for you. There's not a one size fits all. I talk about obviously the peak hours, and I do have some patients, for example, who will only go running or walk outside, at like 6, 7 o'clock in the morning or late at night. So it's not so crazy to suggest trying to avoid outdoor time. But then I also talk about window exposure, which I think is important.
Yeah.
Someone sitting by a window, while a lot of windows will filter out UVB, they miss the UVA, which won't be as obvious in terms of exposure. It's not as erythemogenic as UVB, and so you could be causing damage. And actually, a recent Nature Communication paper really highlighted the potential injury with UVA on various cell lines and the mutations that are incurred. So I think that it's being mindful of your environment, but some very simple measures to physically block UV radiation. And I know also the whole kind of thing about visible light and blue light from screens that people are talking about more from a photo aging perspective. I really don't get too much into it. Those patients bring it up because honestly, how much time do we have in the office? And I think to me, the big things are what's going to kill you and or what's going to maim you, and that's going to be obviously skin cancer and resulting surgery, or if it's too late beyond that, and adjunctive therapies that could be life-saving but also life-altering. So I'm
Yeah,
really going
yeah,
to
yeah.
focus more on that.
No, so I mean, I think you're sort of advocating the comprehensive approach, right? And
Absolutely.
avoidance and clothing, shade, and then last sunscreen. And you're absolutely right. And I think just minor point, I think there are some really beautiful UPF clothings and much more fashionable, and you should come
My
to
my wife would
California.
disagree, but
So, couple of things, right? And let's just touch a little bit about blue light. And so you talked about the visible light is more damaging to causing pigmentation, especially for darker individuals, right? But they don't have the same like UV damaging potential to causing skin cancer at this point.
correct.
Yeah, and also I
Absolutely.
think the phones and the screens in front of us don't put out as much of the blue light that will be causing those kind of harm. So that's something else.
Agreed.
Yeah. Um, This is the one thing you and I always talked about. Why do you think there are so many controversies associated with sunscreen? Bottom line is, okay, a couple of things. Is sunscreen safe in your mind? Let's get that out of the way, and then we can go touch upon every single one of the controversies out there and try to hit as many as we can.
So
Go ahead.
yeah, first of all, yes, it's safe. I think it's absolutely safe. I think that your first question is a harder one. Why is there so much controversy? And I think it feeds into our inherent need to protest. I'm reminded of a movie, PCU, which honestly got it so right. I mean, how could they have predicted how our culture environment would evolve? But I think that sunscreen is such an easy target, and it is so easy to extrapolate, especially when you think about safety, an in vitro study, for example, a study looking at cell lines or even animal studies that may not necessarily translate to the human condition or daily life. And it's so simple to really jump on that fearmonger. And I think it's only gotten worse with the rapid deployment and utilization of social media, and everyone want to have a platform and having a message. And I think it's such an easy one to really get behind because fear sells. Fear sells. People want a common enemy. And because of the fact that you have these kind of little nuggets out there, they've really have escalated exponentially to even result in, for example, banning of several ingredients in different states based on really limited data.
Okay, before we go,
yeah, well, we're not talking that yet.
No, no. Before we go down there, and let's go through every single one of them, right? So
Sure.
because the first one, since you touched upon banning of sunscreen, and I know you're referring to like state of Hawaii banning oxybenzone, actinoxate, 2 UV filters for fear of reef safety, right? Why don't we touch upon that first?
Right.
And
I think
go ahead.
I think that's a classic example of really taking bench research, work done at the lab, work that's done in an artificial environment, and extrapolating that to real life without really connecting the dots in a scientific manner. And so, for example, what they found that the concentration of these ingredients that would result in damage to reef cells, so to speak, was on a magnitude higher than is actually found in the real world. That the parts per million were a log higher used to actually cause damage than is actually found in highly vacationed areas. So it's a reach, and I think to maybe take a parallel story with microbeads, where microbeads were banned. These are were used in a lot of other kind of products based on mathematical modeling, not even actually identifying this being a problem in the water source. The theory was that these get through filtration, they end up in the water source, and they're going to result in that very classic scene from that movie I Am Legend, where the whole planet is either dead or zombies. And there wasn't actually data to suggest that. It was all based on mathematical modeling. Now, getting back to the reef story, this is based on not real world, but rather a in vitro bench environment showing that, at a certain concentration, you would cause damage. And the truth is, an ingredient's not toxic, a concentration is. Toxicity is all based on concentration. And so that's where I think there is a miscommunication of sorts in terms of how that could be translated to the real world. But yet, to your point, actions were taken to limit access to two tried and true UV filters in an environment where it's so hard to even get a new one into the marketplace, or even have the FDA really commit to saying that one is really safe, that really falls under the generally regarded as safe and effective category.
So I think for people who don't really know about the reef issues, I'm going to step back, just give some background education.
Sure.
So, obviously people find that there's throughout the world, there's a bleaching and death of coral reef, right? And even though it constitutes a very small percentage of the ocean floor, but it supports tons of marine life, tourist industry, lots of people living off that. And also coral is beautiful. And once you see those organisms dying overnight, and it's just very, just kind of a very sad event. And I think a lot of people want to do something. And I think the idea, what you're talking about, Adam, is, they put it in this, like exactly in the laboratory setting, they put in the levels about three orders of magnitude, 10,000, 1,000 times greater than what you find in the ocean life, right? And then the reality is that, people think that it is the global warming event that's basically killing the coral reef. And the unfortunately reality, you can't stop global warming, but you can basically pass legislation in stopping this. So the question is, people are going to say, okay, you sort of touched upon this a little bit, right? Now we got the physical sunscreen, we got the quote unquote chemical sunscreen. I don't really like the name chemical,
Right.
and we can touch upon that later. And what's the harm just using the physical sunscreen?
So there isn't. And I think that is an overarching message in that at a certain point, if you are, not seeing eye to eye and you're going back and forth, whether the concern is related to coral reef bleaching, whether the concern we're going to get into some of the other,
We will
myths and
get into it.
misperceptions, but any of the other ones, let's say you're going back and forth and you're just not getting the point across there, you're not meeting eye to eye. At the end of the day, your job is not to convince someone to use a particular type of sunscreen. It's to get them to use a sunscreen that will be effective in protecting them from the harmful effects of UV radiation. And given the fact that mineral sunscreens are the only two, zinc oxide, titanium dioxide, under the umbrella of generally regarded as safe and effective, that is the kind of path of least resistance. They come with limitations more probably from a cosmesis standpoint than a safety standpoint, which you certainly have to address on several different levels, depending on the patient, depending on their skin tone. But I think that if you're seeing that the conversation is going nowhere, you're kind of enjoying the lawyer-esque aspects of that argument, walk it back. And I think remember why you're having this conversation in the first place. Make sure that at the end of the day, they are going to use something or walk out of your office knowing they need to use sunscreen. They feel comfortable with a particular formulation. And I think the mineral, the physical UV filters are always a safe option when you can't really convince someone otherwise.
All right, so I'm going to play devil's advocate with you a little bit. All right, so we talked about, titanium dioxide, zinc oxide is being safe, it's effective. And right now it's FDA ranked them as class 1, generalized, safe, and effective, right? We can touch upon those a little bit later. And you mentioned the cosmetic element because those things make you look white, but obviously you can micronize it and you can nanosize it, right? So that you reduce that white appearance because you nanosize it. Now, question: are those nanoparticles, are they dangerous?
So I'm glad you brought that up. I knew that was coming at some point. So of all the different controversies, I think
just for all of
yeah, I think
for
this
full
one has been
disclosure, you and I wrote a book on this stuff, and so okay, we're on the same page. But go on. I
kind
want
of
you to
teed that up there. Look at a little alley-oop layup there. So I think of all the controversy, this one has really been put to bed the most in that we know that these are safe. This has been proven in vivo in humans with some really cool fancy schmancy imaging technology showing that these do not penetrate the skin. And that's really the concern, because at the end of the day, this is going to sound crazy, these physical sunscreens are actually photocatalysts. They actually can generate oxidative stress. However, when they sit on the top of the skin, not an issue. And so the concern is if they get through the skin, they get into cells and they generate oxidative stress, free radicals, is that going to be problematic? And time and again, this has been shown that especially the commercial formulations, let alone the kind of lab grade stuff, does not penetrate through the skin. This has been shown using confocal Raman spectroscopy, various other imaging modalities have been shown in injured skin, sunburned skin. It just does not get through. Then throw in the commercial formulations that are purposely designed to aggregate, to come together and be actually on the larger, still small enough not to reflect visible light so you see it, but still large enough to not get through the stratum corneum, to the point where the EU has globally said these are safe so long as they're not in aerosolized formulations. They don't want you inhaling these. That's fair. Don't eat them either. Okay, I'm cool with that. who eats their sunscreen? I don't know. People do, I guess. But in general, the formulations available, lotions, potions, whatever, they are considered safe across the EU. And I think even those who have been very against nanoscaled materials in sunscreens, individuals like Friends of the Earth, Environmental Working Group, they've kind of taken a step back and they're paying more attention to some of the other controversial ingredients. Universally, nanoscaled mineral filters are considered safe. So I think we can feel good about those.
Okay, so I'm glad that there's one group of sunscreen.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we have nothing left. Okay, so we for those folks out there listening to this whole discussion, and we talked a little bit about different classes. There's physical sunscreen, that titanium dioxide, zinc oxide. In the US, we have all this other organic or chemical filters, right? And at this point, the FDA basically did 2 studies to show that some of those chemical filters actually penetrate through the skin and reach the bloodstream, and it's systemically absorbed. And for that reason, and they want additional study to look at the safety issues, right? So this is where we are right now. But why don't I'm gonna let you talk about this, Adam. Is that dangerous to have those filters being absorbed into a bloodstream?
Yeah. So my initial response to every patient, especially when those 2 papers came out, I did get a lot of questions about that, especially that first week. My first response is correlation does not equal causation. And then, of course, I go on because I think to leave them at that and walk out the room would probably leave myself with many bad Yelp reviews. What I mean by that is just because
they would just say you're a philosopher instead of a technologist, but go on.
It's real. I mean, I was wearing a toga and everything when I said this and had a little wreath around my head. So I think the point of that is just because something's there doesn't mean it's dangerous. And what these studies showed, and I think more of anything, it was to show that they could detect these UV filters at the nanomolar concentration. We're talking about a billionth of the mole.
It's like, I think it's 0.5 nanogram per liter, that concentration, that level.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It is such a minuscule amount. Part of this was to show that we could detect it there and realize they were detecting after maximal, optimal, ridiculous use that no one does. This was like multiple times a day, full body, the amount that was applied per, centimeter, per square centimeter was more than anyone actually does. So this was optimal use. Could we actually find those nanomolar concentrations? The answer was yes. Now, the second question, and really the bigger part, is just because it's there doesn't mean it's actually causing harm at that concentration. Remember, concentration dictates toxicity, not the actual ingredient. And they couldn't prove that. And actually, in the second larger study, the authors went as far to say that probably with some hindsight from the first paper where they didn't really talk about that, we're just showing it's there. We're not insinuating that this causes cancer like some mineral-based sunscreen companies put out in email blasts to their consumers, that this study was insinuating that, and absolutely neither was insinuating that. So I think it shows, yes, the skin is a portal to the inside, that the skin is not pure armor, that there is a connection to all organ systems, and that is a portal to the systemic vasculature, the blood supply. So we need to better understand what does that mean, but also realize, because there hasn't been anything new in the UV filter world for a long time, these filters have been around for a very long time. And so, yeah, if they're getting the blood now, guess what? They're getting the blood before. And so we have not seen some dramatic increase in various types of cancers in association with sunscreen use. So I think that it's very important to take these for what they are, to follow through and actually do the research now that we know they're there, better understand what that means. But we also should not overstate the conclusions from both studies, which I think is being misinterpreted as that because it's in our blood, that is a problem. We don't know that. That is where we are.
Yeah. And I think you raised a couple of really good points. I think one thing we should just clarify, I think they were using this stuff like 2 milligram per centimeter square. That's the testing dosage. But in reality, most people only use like a quarter of that amount. Right. Because, we always mention that in order to use a 2 milligram per centimeter square for a whole body, you need about 1 shot glass full of it. Adam, I think you're broke. Hello? Adam? So just getting back to repeat that, I think we should educate the folks about, what the actual dosage. They were using 2 milligram per centimeter square. And but reality, most people only use quarter that amount, basically. So that's number one. Number
Right.
two, they were using it 4 times a day. And most people hardly remember putting just on once. Right? And so that's the
Right.
difference. That's what you mean about the maximum usage. And I think you hit it, you're so right, basically talking about exposure, right? The phrase. Like I always like to say that, if you take one ibuprofen or Advil, if you have a headache, that's very therapeutic, that's very beneficial. But if I give you like 3 bottles full of the stuff all at once, you're gonna have a GI bleed, you're gonna end up in the hospital. That is the exposure level, right?
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, like it's unfortunate that a lot of those social media, a lot of those newspaper reporting, media reporting, they take this one report and they just sort of extrapolate and
Right.
create this fear, basically. Yeah, yeah. So, obviously we touched a lot about this stuff, and you mentioned a great deal about this idea of, sunscreen's been using it for a long time, they don't cause cancer. One of the bigger thing is endocrine disrupting, right? Especially associated with oxybenzone. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yep. So in a similar fashion to the coral reef issue, that really came about from more basic science work and preclinical work, meaning with animals.
Yeah.
So there were kind of two studies. One was looking at the influence of oxybenzone on certain cancer cell lines, and it did show that it accelerated their growth. The second, which I think has less clinical translation, that they fed oxybenzone to rats in what's called a uterotropic assay, where they fed it and then they actually measured the weight of the uterus before and after, and showed that there was some thickening there, suggesting that there was influence on hormone disruption is an interesting word. There was some hormonal influence, and so you could say influence disruption. Disruption certainly is catchier and scarier. And I want to give you definitely a shout out for a nice editorial that you wrote, where you mathematically calculated how much someone would have to apply sunscreen in over what time period to ever get the systemic levels that would possibly disrupt one's hormones. And it was astronomical. It was like, I think it was over 100 years. I don't remember the exact number, but I remember reading that and I was like slow clapping. Thank you, Steve, for that. Because it was really such a nice paper that demonstrated that, okay, in theory, that sounds nice, but really, what would someone have to do to ever emulate this in the real world?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the problem. And you also, like in the mathematical model we did, it was like 72 years if you just putting out, like you do it every day, like regardless if it's like whether it's winter in Boston or something like that. But if you're just gonna do it in a certain way, let's say every day, just kind of put on the face and the hands every day, and in the summertime, gonna put on everywhere. It's like almost 270 years. So again, and then also does not take into account of your body is able to excrete the material out, right? So that's another thing. So I'm very grateful because we sort of got the time screwed up, and you and I always have the problem. And last time you tried to interview me, I don't know how to use Instagram. That was a very embarrassing. And so, and I know you have to go home and pick up your kids, everything. So here's the bottom line, right? We got very few minutes left. I know you got to go. Thank you so much for just jump on in the last minute. What do you use? What kind of sunscreen do you use yourself? Physical, organic, UV filter, or what do you use?
So as a dermatologist, I'm really lucky because we get sent so many samples. So I'm really looking for the basics. There's two kind of like levels. So
Okay.
first is I want a higher SPF, because I know, to your point, I'm not going to apply the right amount to get the SPF number on there, which I know only blocks UVB. So I want a UVA, UVB broad spectrum sunscreen, SPF 50 or higher, only because I know I'm not going to apply the right amount on. I really am a fan of combination approaches. I do like products that have both mineral and it's funny, the terms either organic or chemical filters. That's so funny to me because you say chemical to some people, they're like, oh my God. You say organic, oh, I like that. It's organic. Wonderful.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
vice versa. It's
yeah.
hilarious that we use the same term to describe the same ingredients. But I think that there has been evidence that highlights that if you combine them, they actually synergize in that the reflective capacity of the mineral sunscreens will actually protect the chemical sunscreen ingredients from absorbing that energy, getting their electrons going to an excited state. And at some point they get stuck up there. So they're useless. They don't come down to ground level and exude that energy as heat. So I think they do play nice on each other. So I kind of look for it, but the reality is I just go with what's easiest because we're lucky we get this like thrown at us. The other piece which we didn't touch upon is I also prefer using products from larger companies, established companies that actually invest in research and development, that actually do studies on their products. But also I know from a quality assurance standpoint that they are going to make sure that A, the product that I'm using has been well tested, and B, are going to be conscientious if there is a, for example, a contaminant like, I don't know, benzene, they're going to come out and pull that off the shelf. And I have to give, some of those companies credit for really stepping up. And even though we know it's a contaminant, it's not from the sunscreen, they still want to ensure safety. And so I think that going with, well-known brands that have the capacity and the wherewithal to ensure efficacy and safety makes me more confident when I'm using said sample.
No, I'm glad you sort of touched upon benzene. That was a really good discussion. I just thought
See what I did there?
love it, and I just thought that you were gonna say you use the sunscreen whatever your wife gave you, but that's besides the point. But no, okay, let's step back a little bit. What about your kids? Like, do you make a distinction to say, hey, listen, because kids have like smaller body to volume surface ratio and everything else, and you worry about systemic absorption, so that's why you're using the physical sunscreen. Oh, you don't mind?
So my children at this point are 11 and 9. So I'm not as concerned. And I would more think about chemical versus mineral with respect to sensitivity, in terms of the potential for irritancy. And that still does happen. My kids, and it takes only a handful of times for them to run away as soon as I pull the bottle out of the bag.
Sure.
One time when they're like, it burns, I need to wash it off. And of course they throw water and it makes it hurt even more. So I think that's where mineral sunscreens, I think, are really going to shine because they're inert. They really don't cause irritation. Though I'd argue it's probably excipients in the vehicle that are more problematic than the actual filters. But no, at that point, it's more of what can I get them to apply? And so vehicles that are going to be easier to apply over broad surface areas, lotions, they like sticks a lot, especially on the face, because I think it's a little easier for them to apply. Sprays only because it's easier, but I make sure to show them how to do it. One of these thermal spring water sprays ain't going to cut it. They need to be 2 centimeters from the skin, really close. They should see it like dripping off their skin before they rub it in. But it's more about what will they use and use repeatedly, not so much a particular ingredient or a filter. I just want them using something at this age. But when they were much younger, I definitely was leaning more on the mineral filters.
Yeah, I think, and also like when they're younger, like babies, we advocate for like hats and clothing type of thing, just because they offer much better protection. And I totally agree with you. And I think you said it very, very early on. That is, the best sunscreen is someone that actually going to use it, right? Regardless the SPF, regardless of everything else. Well, Adam, I know you have to go. I'm truly appreciative of the fact that you just jumped on this in the last minute. And thank you again for joining us on the Beating Melanoma project. And love to have you back. You and I can talk about this stuff all day long.
For sure.
Thanks again.
Thanks. Good to see you, Steve.
Bye.
Bye.